The most dangerous building in China may be one that nobody will ever live in. A family has already paid for it. A bank has already issued the mortgage, a developer has already spent much of the deposit, a local government has already counted the land sale as revenue, and somewhere behind all of them, a financing company has already borrowed against the belief that the land underneath that unfinished tower will keep rising in value. There may be no lights in the windows, no furniture in the rooms, and no families in the elevators. But financially, that empty building is carrying the weight of an entire system. Now imagine that tower repeated across hundreds of cities. Then imagine the buyers stop arriving. That is the real Chinese property crisis. It is not simply a story about too many apartments. It is the moment when one asset stops performing 5 jobs at once: home retirement account, developer financing, local government revenue, and bank collateral. And in 2026, the numbers are no longer whispering. During the first half of this year, real estate development investment fell 18%. New construction starts dropped more than 23%. New property sales by value fell almost 14%. Funding available to developers fell 20%, while domestic bank lending to them dropped nearly 32%. Even completed floor space declined more than 23%. Those are not the numbers of a normal housing slowdown. They describe a machine still losing fuel 5 years after the market peaked. But here is where the story becomes more interesting than the headline that says China is dead. China's economy still grew 4.7% in the first half of 2026. High-tech manufacturing grew more than 13%. Exports rose more than 13%. Industrial robots, batteries, aerospace equipment, and digital infrastructure are expanding quickly. At the same time, retail sales grew only 1.3%. Construction output contracted, property investment collapsed again. Families earned more income but remained cautious about spending it. So China is not dead. It is splitting into 2 economies. One China is producing, exporting, automating, and investing in the technologies of the future. The other China is staring at a damaged family balance sheet, a shrinking property market, and a local government that no longer has the money it once received from selling land. The future of the world's second-largest economy depends on whether those 2 Chinas can be reconnected. To understand why, go back to that unfinished apartment. In many countries, a home is both a place to live and an investment. In China, housing became something larger. Homeownership is above 90% by widely used estimates, and housing has represented more than 2/3 of household assets in past surveys. The exact share changes with the method and the year, but the basic fact is not controversial. Property became the dominant store of wealth for ordinary families. That concentration did not happen because Chinese households were irrational. It reflected the system around them. Deposit rates were controlled for years. Capital controls limited easy access to foreign assets. Domestic stock markets were volatile. The social safety net remained uneven. For a family worried about retirement, medical costs, education, and the future of its children, an apartment felt visible, understandable, and safe. Property also became tied to marriage, social status, access to schools, and security in old age. Parents saved for their children's down payments. Grandparents transferred decades of accumulated savings into a single purchase. A new apartment did not merely represent square meters. It represented a family's place in the future, and for a long time, the strategy worked. Urbanization brought hundreds of millions of people into cities. Incomes rose, credit expanded. Land became more valuable. Families that bought early appeared to grow wealthier every year. Rising prices did more than reward owners. They convinced the next buyer that waiting was dangerous. That belief was strengthened by the presale system. In China, developers commonly sold apartments before they were completed. A buyer could take out a mortgage and begin paying for a home that might still be a blueprint or a concrete shell. In theory, presale funds were supposed to support construction of that project. In practice, fast-growing developers often use cash across a much larger corporate network, paying contractors, servicing debt, purchasing more land, and starting the next development. As long as sales kept rising, the model looked efficient. Money from new buyers helped complete older projects. Completed projects built trust. Trust attracted more buyers. More buyers created more land purchases, more construction, and more local government revenue. It was not necessarily fraud. It was a funding model built on continuous growth. And continuous growth is exactly what disappeared. By 2020, regulators could see that developer leverage had become dangerous. The so-called 3 red lines placed limits on debt relative to cash, assets, and equity. The objective was understandable: prevent the property sector from borrowing forever and threatening the financial system. But the rules also revealed how dependent developers had become on refinancing and presales. A company that could survive while debt rolled over suddenly had to reduce leverage. A developer that relied on tomorrow's apartment sales to finish yesterday's apartments discovered that tomorrow's buyers were becoming nervous. Then the feedback loop reversed. Restrictions reduced borrowing. Reduced borrowing slowed construction. Slower construction frightened buyers. Fewer buyers reduced presale cash. Less presale cash slowed even more construction. What had once been a growth engine became a confidence trap. Evergrande became the symbol of that reversal. At its peak, it was one of the largest developers on Earth, with operations far beyond ordinary home building and liabilities of roughly $300 billion. When its financing model failed, the important lesson was not simply that one company had borrowed too much. The lesson was that buyers who thought they were purchasing homes had also been financing a corporate expansion machine. Country Garden showed that the problem was not limited to one reckless firm. It had once been considered healthier and more focused on lower-tier cities. But when sales weakened across those cities, even scale became a liability. Thousands of projects required cash at the same time that households became least willing to provide it. The crisis then reached the person who had done everything the system asked. Imagine a young couple who paid a down payment, signed a mortgage, and waited for delivery. The developer runs short of cash, construction stops. The apartment cannot be occupied, rented, or sold easily, yet the mortgage remains. The family is not only losing an investment, it is paying every month for the absence of a home. That is why unfinished housing is more damaging than an ordinary fall in prices. A lower price hurts wealth. A missing home damages trust in the entire transaction. The government has made real progress on delivery. According to the World Bank, project whitelists and related support had helped complete around 7.5 million units by the end of 2025. More than 7 trillion yuan in loans had been channeled toward viable projects by early 2026. But the remaining problem is still enormous. Private estimates cited by the World Bank place the original pool of presold but unfinished units somewhere between roughly 20 million and 48 million, depending on what stages of construction are counted. That wide range itself reveals the problem. There is no single transparent national number that tells buyers exactly how much remains unresolved. Meanwhile, the financing squeeze continues. Developer funding fell for 12 consecutive months through May 2026. Domestic bank loans to developers were down about 36% in May. Presales still provided roughly 30% of developer funding in 2025, meaning the industry remains heavily dependent on the confidence it has already damaged. No, follow the apartment one step deeper, beneath the developer and into the budget of the city itself. China's local governments provide public services infrastructure, transportation, education, and many of the visible improvements that transformed the country. But after the 1994 tax-sharing reform, the central government collected a larger share of important tax revenue while local governments retained major spending responsibilities. Land became the bridge across that gap. The state owns urban land, and local governments can sell long-term land, use rights to developers. During the boom, a rising property market created a powerful cycle. Developers bought land, local governments received cash. That cash financed roads, metro lines, industrial parks, and public services. Better infrastructure raised nearby land values. Higher land values produced larger future sales. The city did not simply benefit from the property boom, its budget learned to expect the boom. When formal borrowing limits became restrictive, many localities also relied on local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs. These companies borrowed to build infrastructure and pursue development goals outside the narrow definition of the official government balance sheet. Some projects created genuine long-term value. Others produced weak cash flow and depended on refinancing land revenue or implicit government support. The scale is difficult to measure because the boundary between a commercial company and a government obligation is not always clear. The IMF estimates LGFV debt using a broader economic definition than China's Ministry of Finance. On that basis, it projects LGFV debt at roughly 53% of GDP in 2026, more than 76 trillion yuan. That does not mean 76 trillion yuan will default. Much of the debt is held inside a state-influenced financial system, and many vehicles own real assets or receive local support. But it does mean the property downturn has damaged one of the key sources local governments once used to service obligations and fund new activity. In the first 5 months of 2026, land lease revenue fell almost 29% from a year earlier. The decline was not an isolated bad month. It extended a multi-year contraction. This is the second reversed feedback loop. Weaker home sales reduce developer demand for land. Weaker land sales reduce local government revenue. Weaker local finances reduce infrastructure spending and support for local businesses. Slower local growth makes households more cautious. Cautious households buy fewer homes. The apartment is no longer only an unfinished building. It has become a missing line in a city budget. Now we can understand why the damage appears in shopping malls, restaurants, car dealerships, and household bank accounts, even when those businesses have nothing to do with construction. When the value of a family's largest asset falls, the family feels poorer. When delivery of a new home becomes uncertain, saving feels safer than spending. When local government finances weaken, households worry about employment, services, and future taxes or fees. Each decision to save is rational for the individual family. Added together, those decisions weaken the entire economy. The World Bank estimated China's precautionary household saving rate at 32.4% in the first quarter of 2026, compared with a pre-pandemic average of 29.6%. Real household consumption growth slowed to 2.6%, its weakest rate since late 2022. This is the balance. Sheet recession hidden inside the official growth number. During a normal slowdown, lower interest rates can persuade people to borrow and spend. During a balanced sheet recession, people care less about the price of credit because they are trying to repair wealth, reduce risk, and avoid another bad asset. A cheaper mortgage does not solve the fear that the home may fall in value. A smaller down payment does not guarantee the developer will finish the building. That is why repeated property stimulus can produce a brief improvement in major cities without restoring the old national machine. In the spring of 2026, first-tier cities showed modest price gains after purchase restrictions and financing rules were eased, but the recovery did not spread evenly. The World Bank estimated that national housing sales remained around half their mid-2021 peak, while real housing prices were about 23% below their July 2021 high. By March 2026, existing inventory would have taken an estimated 30 months to clear even if no additional homes were built. And that figure does not capture every pre-sold unit still somewhere in the construction pipeline. The demographic clock makes the old solution even harder to restart. China's population fell by 3.39 million in 2025. There were 7.92 million births and 11.31 million deaths. The population is aging. The working age share is declining. An average household size has fallen to roughly 2.5 people. Urbanization can still create housing demand. China still has millions of people moving between regions and seeking better homes, and the official urbanization rate reached almost 68% in 2025. The market is not going to zero, but tomorrow's demand will not look like yesterday's. A shrinking population, smaller families, and already high home ownership mean many cities cannot assume an endless supply of first-time buyers. Demand will concentrate in places with jobs, good schools, healthcare, and real population inflows. A valuable apartment in Shanghai and an empty apartment in a shrinking third-tier city may both be called housing, but economically they are different assets. This is why the phrase China's property market can be misleading. There is no single market. There are global cities with constrained supply, growing regional hubs, aging industrial towns, and newly built districts that may never receive the population once projected for them. The correction will not distribute losses evenly. So why has China not suffered a sudden Lehman-style banking collapse? Because this is not the United States in 2008, Chinese banks are largely state-controlled. The capital account is managed. Regulators can extend loan maturities, encourage mergers, direct lending, swap local debt into longer-term government bonds, and prevent fire sales that would otherwise force prices down immediately. Mortgages historically required meaningful down payments, and household borrowers generally remain responsible for repayment even if the home loses value. Officially, the banking system still reports strong buffers. By September 2025, commercial banks had a capital adequacy ratio above 15% and a non-performing loan ratio around 1.5%. Those figures support the argument that a nationwide banking panic is not the base case, but control does not erase losses, it changes their speed, location, and visibility. A bad loan can be extended. An LGFV can refinance at a lower rate. A state bank can absorb pressure. A local debt can be swapped into a longer maturity. An unfinished project can receive directed credit. These actions can prevent a sudden crash, and that matters. They also mean weak assets may remain inside the system for years, consuming bank capital and public resources that could have financed more productive businesses. The danger is not necessarily one dramatic explosion. It is a long period in which yesterday's debts claim tomorrow's income. That distinction also explains why the rest of the world should care. China's old property model consumed extraordinary quantities of steel, copper, cement, glass, appliances, and energy. A smaller construction sector changes demand for commodity exporters and global manufacturers. Countries and companies that built forecasts around endless Chinese building must adjust to a structurally smaller engine. At the same time, weak domestic demand gives Chinese factories a reason to look abroad. If households at home will not buy enough goods, producers can cut prices, increase volume, and compete for foreign customers. The IMF has warned that weak domestic demand, combined with strong exports and excess supply in some industries, can create spillovers and trade tension. This is the global paradox. China's property slump can reduce its demand for the world's raw materials while increasing the world's supply of manufactured goods. For consumers abroad, cheaper products may feel beneficial. For competing manufacturers and governments, they can look like imported deflation and lost industrial capacity. The property crisis does not need to travel through mortgage-backed securities to become global. It can travel through commodity prices, factory orders, trade balances, and politics. Now comes the hardest question: can Beijing fix it? It has more tools than almost any government on Earth. The central government has a stronger balance sheet than many localities. State banks can be recapitalized. Mortgage rates and purchase rules can be adjusted. Public money can complete unfinished homes. Unsold apartments can be converted into affordable or rental housing. Local debt can be exchanged for longer-term official debt. Stronger social benefits can give households more confidence to spend. Many of these policies are already underway. The whitelist program supports viable projects. State entities have been encouraged to buy idle land and excess housing. A multi-year debt swap program is moving some hidden local obligations onto official balance sheets. Major cities have relaxed restrictions. The government has also placed greater emphasis on consumption in the new 5-year plan. But every rescue has to answer the same question: who accepts the loss? If the government protects the homebuyer, the developer's creditors may lose. If it protects the creditor, taxpayers may absorb the cost. If a local government buys unsold land or apartments at an unrealistic price, debt has moved from one public pocket to another. If banks extend every week loan forever, credit remains trapped in low-return assets. If prices are prevented from adjusting, genuine private buyers may keep waiting. There is no policy that can make every apartment worth its old price, finish every project, repay every creditor, protect every local budget, and preserve rapid growth at the same time. The least damaging solution is likely to be the least theatrical one. First, guarantee delivery of viable presold homes, so families receive the asset they are already paying for. Restoring the basic contract between buyer and builder matters more than creating another week of higher sales. Second, restructure developers and LGFVs that cannot repay from realistic future cash flow. Refinancing can buy time, but time has value only if the underlying project eventually produces income. Third, move more fiscal support directly toward households. Better pensions, healthcare coverage, unemployment protection, and access to public services would reduce the need for families to treat an empty apartment as their only safety net. Fourth, allow cities to become different. Growing regions may still need new housing. Shrinking regions need renovation, consolidation, demolition, or conversion rather than another tower. A national construction target cannot solve a local population problem. And finally, accept that a healthier economy may grow more slowly. Replacing debt-financed construction with household consumption and productive private investment is not a one-year stimulus project. It is a change in who receives income, who bears risk, and what the government rewards. From here, watch 5 numbers, watch new home sales, because confidence begins with buyers. Watch completions, because delivery restores trust. Watch land. Lease revenue, because it reveals pressure on local budgets. Watch developer funding, especially pre-sale receipts and bank loans. And watch household consumption, because the property crisis is not truly ending until families feel safe enough to spend again. Do not be fooled by 1 month of higher prices in Beijing or Shanghai. Do not be fooled by one giant GDP number either. And do not be fooled by the opposite extreme, the claim that the entire Chinese economy has already died. The data show something more complicated and more important. China still has world-class factories, enormous savings, powerful state institutions, advanced infrastructure, and growing technology sectors. It also has a property model that no longer matches its demographics, household confidence, or local government finances. The country is not standing at the edge of one simple collapse. It is trying to carry the wealth promises of the past into an economy that needs a completely different engine, and that brings us back to the empty tower. The concrete was never the most valuable thing inside it. The valuable thing was belief. The family's belief that the home would be delivered. The bank's belief that the mortgage was safe. The developer's belief that another buyer would arrive. And the local government's belief that land would always become more expensive. Once that belief breaks, cutting interest rates is easy. Rebuilding trust is the expensive part. China's property crisis will end only when an apartment can go back to being a home, not a retirement plan, not a local tax system, not a corporate financing machine, and not collateral for another layer of hidden debt. Until then, every unfinished tower is more than an empty building. It is a balance sheet waiting for someone to admit the loss.